Welcome to Inform TV. I'm Alan Repke, Alexandria, Minnesota. We're recording this program on May 23rd, 2012. And our regular audience, you people that watch Inform TV on a regular basis, you know we talked about some of the things as far as we're going to have to face the reality. It's time to make the cuts. It's time to increase revenue. Both the Republicans and the Democrats, they both have a good idea. One says we got to raise revenue and one says we have to make cuts. And the reality is we have to do both. And we're going to be talking today about the Congressional Budget Office report that was released on Tuesday of this week. And the reality of the thing talks about the, quote, cliff that seems to be panicking stock investors and politicians and academia, when the reality is this report that we're soon going to be talking about and flicking up on the screen is anything but a cliff. It's just the hardcore reality that the Republicans don't want to make any cuts to their fat defense contractors or their fat farmers or their incredibly rich business friends. Probably the same goes for the Democrats. And some of the social programs that we've extended and extended and extended, some of these are going to have to end. People are going to have to make some meaningful adjustments. Some of these house debts are going to have to be written off. We're going to have to give the homeowner the right of first refusal, like we did in the farm crisis of 2008, and don't let the fat cats clean up on this housing disaster caused by the mortgage industry, the realtors, that whole can of worms that should be investigated, and we'll be talking about that more here on Inform TV as time goes by. But the reality is, I think this Congressional Budget Office report was incredibly encouraging, and it shows the super committee that there actually turned out to be some benefits, and what was looked at as just political theater of washing it down and just making one-year provisions on it a few months ago, and with the understanding they were going to change it and keep feeding their fat buddies or their bums that don't want to do anything in the first place. It's a pretty good policy. And if we just let the revenue increase, like we've talked here, Alan Repke has talked about, where we have to have more revenue and we have to make spending cuts, we'll be fine, people. And yet, obviously, there's some additional things that have to take place. These fat cats on the top, their wages and their compensation need to come down dramatically, or tax the living dickens out of them and clean up this budget mess real quick, like we probably should. We can't let this whole system just continue the way it is right now with the Apples and the Facebooks and those type of groups just drowning in cash without bringing jobs back to the good old USA. In fact, one of the things that I was talking about the other day is the fact that if we're going to have jobs in a reasonable basis in the good old USA, it's not like the pundits and the politicians are talking. It's not going to come from small business. It must come from big business. And Apple, I Buddha is my definition of Steve Jobs, is the fact that they're sitting on over $100 billion worth of cash. They employ for these fancy gadgets that I can't afford, or most of you can't afford either, yet are being subsidized by our phone carriers. There's 1 million jobs in Asia. They can take half of that money and come back and build factories here, and that this technology, once again, is employed here rather than everything in Asia. So the reality, people, one of the talking points that I want to make sure that is part of the discussion in the election process of 2012 is the fact that we must bring big business back to America to build things. And yes, we're probably not going to do it at the super high wages that many of these big business unions are demanding. But the reality is we can bring these technology jobs, at least half of them back, that the Apples and this whole technology group has, and bring some real meaningful jobs. Not just make billionaires out of the Silicon Valley people by using the power of U.S. patents and copyrights and trademarks and the Seventh Fleet floating to make sure they make billions, when common citizens here in the United States are losing their homes, wondering about the retirement, wondering about health care. People, the reality is we're going to make some meaningful changes, and this report we're going to take a look at now shows that it will consume a little pain, but nothing to the degree that we're going to have if we don't make it happen. Now, somehow the Congressional Budget Office came up with this title, but the reality is the Congressional Budget Office looked at, if we as taxpayers and we as the electorate don't let these congressmen and senators dodge their responsibility of not letting meaningful revenue increases come into play and get additional cuts, we'll be fine with some of the other things that I talked about just a minute ago, as well as in our program that I recorded yesterday that many of you had an opportunity to see. Here's the whole point. If the fiscal policies currently in place are continued in coming years, the revenues collected by the federal government will fall far short of federal spending. That gap will grow over time as the aging of the population and the rising cost of health care continues to boost federal spending under current policy. Therefore, putting the budget on a sustainable path will require significant changes in spending policy, tax policies, or both. And don't we all know that? So don't we as people need to be putting our finger on the chest of these politicians and making sure that we start facing reality? That's what Informed TV is all about. And here's the other significant thing that we as taxpayers and the electorate need to talk about. Under current law, the federal budget deficit will fall dramatically between 2012 and 2013. Isn't that what we want? The budget deficit to fall dramatically? In other words, if this policy that the billionaires, the millionaires, and academia are talking about that they don't want, if we just let that happen, what's going to happen? We're going to start getting this budget deficit under control. Now, they use some strange words. They continue with owing to scheduled increase in taxes and to a lesser extent scheduled reduction in spending. In other words, people, these farm subsidies need to end. This crop insurance subsidy needs to end. There's a number of things in the defense budget that needs to end. There is no reason that we can't cut the defense budget by 15% and keep everything flowing. These fat cats in the defense industry are getting big wages. They're working on 30% profit margins, and the reality of that whole fence deal, it's time Congress and the president goes to them and say, hey, we have to clean up our mess. You guys either get a 15% across the board and continue to provide the goods and services the American people need, or we're going to nationalize it just like we did in World War II and see that you fat cats aren't filling your pockets without defending the American people. It's time to get some tough people in leadership positions and say, we all have to make a living, we all have to have health care, we all have to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, but we have to do it in a broad basis. Anyway, they go on to say here, development of some observations have referred to as the fiscal cliff, their own numbers here shows people there really is no fiscal cliff unless you wanted this inflated growth, inflated prices for what they talked about, the medical profession and the gadget world and that type of thing. The common people that I talk to here in Informed TV, nothing's booming in your life. And the reality is they don't need that super boom in their life. The reality, we can help the lower end of the totem pole and still not throw things out of whack. And here's what I also see as interesting. Taken together, CBO estimates that policies will reduce the federal deficit by $607 billion, or 4% of GDP, between fiscal 2012 and 13. The resulting weakening of the economy will lower taxable incomes and raise unemployment, generating reduction in tax revenue and an increase in spending in such items as unemployment insurance. With that economic feedback incorporated, the deficit will drop by $560 billion between fiscal 12 and 13. The Congressional Budget Office projects. And the reality of that, people, is when they're talking about weakening of the economy, it's very insignificant because we will have the productivity growth and the demand around the world. And the tables we're going to take a look at here now show it. The scare tactics of the CNBC, the Kudlow propagandists, and others, we have to just plain look at these simple numbers. Here's the numbers, folks. The deficit in 2012, now we're going back to fiscal 2011, when we showed you numbers here, was 1.3 trillion. When we took in tax revenue, I believe it was about 2.6 trillion. So in other words, we were spending 50% more than we were taking in. We all know we can't do that on an individual budget basis. Why are we letting these incompetent congressmen and senators we have do it? And here's what it shows. Changes in the budget deficit under current law between fiscal 12 and 13. Now, fiscal 12 starts the 1st of October. Basically, what we're talking, a tax year is obviously for in a calendar year. But here's what we're talking. They're projecting right now that in the fiscal year we're in right now, they'll end the end of September, we're going to have a deficit of basically $1.2 trillion. I think it might be slightly more than that. But the deficit, if we let this so-called cliff these windbags have been talking about, if we let this policy come into place, the deficit drops to $612 billion. Isn't that about half? In my math it is anyway. What more could we ask? That's exactly what we have. That's a reasonable approach. And then you put in items that I've talked about here before, and suddenly some spending cuts, people, we can close that gap even more. Now they give the total change here of $560 billion, and now they list the factors that contribute to change in the deficit without affecting the economy, with effects to the economy anyway. The expiration of certain income tax, estate taxes, gifts taxes scheduled to expire on 2012. What is that, people? They're talking about income taxes, estate taxes, and gifts taxes. That's all fat cat stuff. The fat cats can contribute $221 billion, no questions asked, and they're still going to live better than 90% of the American people by far. So we'll look at these numbers here that I'm reading straight across the line. First, we've got these super tax breaks that should have never been put in place in the first place. We get $221 billion there. The expiration of the employee portion of payroll tax, in other words, the 2% reduction in Social Security. That's $195 billion, $100 billion, people that should have never been put in place. When we had, what did we just read before? Our aging population. Why, if we're going to have Social Security for old-timers like me and for the next generation, and mankind's habits prove that we need that kind of protection for people in the future, the last thing we want to do is cut that. We need to get that back to a full 6.2% of wages to make sure we have adequate funds for our senior citizens as time goes forward, including the people under 55. And then we look at other expiring provisions, $65 billion. Taxes included in Affordable Care Act, $18 billion. Which gives us about $400 billion. The other thing that we're talking about for is healthcare. People, the reality is these healthcare insurance companies, these doctors, these massive health organizations, drug companies, they do not need to have these incredible increases. And that's another thing that needs to be front and center on this election drive. But I'll bump these numbers up so you can see them for yourself. The effects of controlling automatic procedures in the budget control, the unemployment benefits being reduced, other changes, total changes in the deficit without the economic feedback, $600 billion as we've just talked. Then they talk about the economic feedback, of which they say there will be likely some less revenue coming in. I really question that, but it gives us some interesting things to look at. And I want to jump a couple pages here and take a look at the next chart, because here's what it shows. These are reasonable requests of the American population. The biggest commitment is going to come from the people that have tons of money, that when I did my program the other day, needed to talk about what really happens when you give one group of people too much money. Does it come around to all of us? Absolutely not. And a prime example, once again, is always farms. Is the best example to understand it. What has happened to farmland prices? Since '85, when we had the farm crisis, prime farmland in southern Minnesota was about $800 an acre. Should have never got that way. It only got that way because disastrous Reagan policies on farm policy. But now it's $8,000 to $9,000 an acre. What is that doing? It's only benefiting a few that own farmland. And in most cases, it's inflated value that has no value for the general population. But here, taking a look, if we let this so-called fiscal cliff, in other words, we should change it to sound policy come into play starting in October 1st of this year and go forward. What's going to happen in the first half of the year of 13? GDP is going to decrease by 1.3%. In other words, we're going to have a slight recession. What's wrong with that? That's part of our cost of having incompetent government and take rather than give a little and make sure the pigs aren't feeding at the trough like they've been for the last 20 years. And by the second half, the Congressional Budget Office, what are they telling us? We're going to back to a GDP growth of 2.3%, which is a historic norm. Recently, I watched some program where it was going back 30 years or maybe even more than that. Average GDP growth was about 2.5%. So if we get these revenue increases that I've told these Republicans, if you guys actually knew anything about restructuring a business, you'd understand first and foremost you have to increase revenue and then slap it back in a Democratic's face. If you guys knew anything about economics, you would understand that you have to cut any fat. And what do we allow this program to come into play? We get to the point where by the second half of the year, we've got normal growth again. And yet, if we let the policies go on that the CNBC crowd, these propagandists on CNBC and our networks, they're actually telling us we're going to have accelerated growth. Growth that what? Causes inflation, causes interest rates to go up. And so the reality, and at the same time, we have this artificial good feeling, but what happens with the deficit? It just goes up. What happens with our long-term debt? It just continues to go into trillions and trillions. And then if the interest thing really sticks, we're totally screwed long term, to put the English plainly. So the reality is what we're getting from this report from the Congressional Budget Office people is that we have to put into the face of these politicians when they return here is the fact that we want these programs that are scheduled to go into effect to take effect, plain and simple. And you tell those idiots, you people call journalists that are celebrity English majors, to start seeing that we start making these cuts and making the revenue increases that we need. Now we also look at what they're talking about on employment. The employment gains are still reasonable. And if we do what I've talked about, instead of sitting with our politicians and our president sitting with his hands in his pocket, watching these companies with all this massive amount of wealth sitting in foreign banks and in islands and dodging taxes like they're doing with these CPAs today, which I call corrupt profit associates. We don't even have any auditors anymore, and we don't have any true investment bankers anymore like I dealt with back in the 70s that wore a fancy suit but had hardcore numbers. They weren't speculators in the stock market. They were there as an alternative to what the banker thought. So the people that were really putting up long-term bonding money or the long-term money for a purchase of a business had somebody in a suit that was of credible reputation to the nth degree, that when they said, yes, this project is a sound project, people could invest in it. And not this speculative wave we have right now. So look at these numbers anyway, people. Everything about this congressional budget report says one thing loud and clear. We just plain have to let it happen. It's the only way to get this thing under control. I'm happy about the effects of this report. And I don't know what kind of garbage you're getting in the news media. I'm doing this. Kudlow's supposed to have a report on it tonight. Many of you will probably watch that on CNBC, the business types anyway. And the networks will be talking about that. But the reality is, people, this is a no-brainer. We have to make sure that those cuts that are talked about as a cliff are no cliff in any manner, shape, or form. They're just something that has to be done, And we as sound people in our establishment have to see that it's happened. It puts the pressure on both the Republicans and Democrats to what? See that we start adopting sound macroeconomic policy, that we start right now taking the uncertainty out that this budget deficit and the debt is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. It says right here, if we do like Repke's been talking on the TV here for months, if we just increase the revenue off these fat cats that are just storing it at islands or our mythical wealth on farmland, we'll be fine. But the macroeconomics of what's going on, this is the only way you address it. Yet at the same time, the program we talked about yesterday as far as wealth, one of the things that I failed to bring up with that program, and you can go online at informtv.com and see it, is the fact that we have to see that individuals, once again, can make sound investments. And one of the things that's glaring on a commercial on TV is you have this professional basketball player who is blessed with being physically very capable. Suddenly he's got 165 Wendy's restaurants. Why doesn't Minnesota, and bring this into the election process, that Minnesota puts a law that no one can own over 2 franchises, whether it's a McDonald's or a Wendy's or those type of things. So individuals who actually do the work in a restaurant that have an opportunity to own them, and we don't let the fat cats own all these apartment buildings and all this type of thing. I think the one morning I was watching on CNBC, one guy owned 2,500 or maybe it's 25,000 apartment buildings. How ridiculous. How can individuals that, when we talked about in the last program and what's going on with this Facebook fiasco, how can we have opportunities if we let these hedge funds and these pension funds get to the point, no matter what a reasonable due diligence shows for a business, we let the power of super money screw things up and turn everything into speculation, as we talked about in our last program. The reality is, when we look at this Facebook thing, all of a sudden now they talked about an individual investor this morning on CNBC, and that individual investor really wasn't investing. He had a synthetic trade in place. We have to get back, people, to sound investing, and we have to do that by seeing that these super fat cats, or the people that bunch together in a pension fund or hedge fund or our own 401k plans, don't get to the point where there is no longer opportunity for individuals to buy a business, to invest in a business, to get paid for their time as well as their investment dollars they put in. People, we got a lot of changes to make, but the good old Congressional Budget Office, that's supposed to be an independent agency, put some hard numbers in our face that says, don't let the politicians off the hook when it comes to making revenue increases and spending cuts. Because if we do that, and the numbers clearly show, we can get the debt under control, we can get the deficit under control, and once again, the fools in Europe can take a beating, but we in the good old USA, capitalism, we can take care of ourselves if we just force our leaders to lead and quit being politicians of wanting to be loved by everybody, be hated by everybody like Repke is here, and the world is a better place to live. It's not flowers and kisses, people. It takes leadership if we're going to get our world in order and keep our financial system in place and enjoy a life as summer comes on, as we have tried to do our entire lifetime, but too many financial problems are affecting too many people. Thanks for listening to Inform TV. I'm Alan Repke, Alexandria, Minnesota.